Hello. This week, briefly, we're going to talk a bit about what was going on in the South, what slavery looked like in the later U.S., right, leading up to the Civil War. So, as you may or may not know, cotton really took over the South. And cotton was demanding work for enslaved workers, so they had to protect the crops from insects, fungus, weather, weeds, and there was something called the army worm, which was an extremely destructive, um, invader of the cotton plants. Sorry, I'm a little bit of a brain fart right now. So this cotton empire started spreading into Texas. They were calling it cotton fever, and it ended up being the primary source of Southern wealth, and exports was cotton. It was very profitable. And so the Upper South ended up turning from tobacco, which had been highly popular, and turning more towards corn and wheat. And because corn and wheat weren't quite as labor intensive, they ended up selling surplus enslaved workers to people in the Deep South where they needed more labor. And so we do have this increase in disease in the South as well. Malaria, yellow fever, cholera, and a lot of that is because they were clearing land for more and more cotton, which increased runoff, caused a lot of flooding, and there ended up being a lot of stagnant water. All right, so in the rural South, in 1860, about 84% of labor was agricultural, and that's compared to in the North, which was about 40% agricultural. So much more agricultural work in the South. So a few large cities in the South because there was this lack of industry compared to the North. And there was also very much a difference in education between North and South. So, the wealthy elite, the people who were slaveholders typically in the South would hire tutors or sent their children to private academies and didn't care much if poor white people or enslaved people had any educational opportunities. So that was really the big difference there. So in 1850, and this is only for white citizens, 20% in the South were illiterate, compared to the middle colonies, about 3% were illiterate, and compared to New England, where only 0.4% were illiterate. So it was a very strong contrast there. Slave labor, of course, is the driving factor for the economy in the South. And so, Southern states could never have developed the way they did unless they, because they had been relying on this enslaved labor and, really gave them quite a large amount of profits. These Southern planters did think of themselves like landed gentry, like what they had over, in Europe, and like these massive estate holders with their serfs, and they're all working the land, and it made them feel like they were special, right? And that is one of the reasons, of course, why it was so hard to do away with. The North, and also even in Europe, they were more and more becoming anti-slavery and very much, not even that, but angry with the South for continuing to hang on to it for so long. So there's continues to be this bigger and bigger divide between the South and almost even the rest of the world. So let's look at what it was like for people who were living lives stuck in slavery. Of course, this varied based on the size of the plantation, what crop they were growing, personality of the slaveholder, and what form of slaveholding was being implemented. In the South, for example, absenteeism was something that was quite popular, and that was where the slaveholder didn't necessarily even live near where the workers were working, and instead they relied on overseers to take care of the enslaved workers, which tended to be a much harsher form of slavery. So smaller farms typically meant better treatment because the slaveholders were working right alongside their workers, whereas on a massive plantation, the slaveholder typically was nowhere to be seen. So there's also different statuses among the workers themselves. So, house servants tended to, have a slightly higher status, or workers that were called drivers. They were supervisors out in the field. They tended to have higher status as compared to your average field hand. And then somewhere in the middle, we'd have people who, performed skilled work, like artisans or crafters of some sort. Another factor that changed, the way working in slavery was experienced was if they used the gang system or if they used the task system. And I believe we've talked about this before. The gang system, usually they're like 20 to 25 workers, and they're being monitored by a driver, very long hours of hard labor. And this was, fairly common, especially with cotton, just day in, day out, long hours of work. Whereas the task system was where an enslaved worker was given a task, and when they were done with whatever amount they were supposed to get done that day, then they would, be done and could do something else. And so that was thought to incentivize people into doing their work more quickly, but also like getting the work done. Rice fields were common for this task system. That's sort of where that originated. Some of them used a combo of some sort. The hours that people would work during the day, during cultivation and harvest periods, they typically worked like 15 to 16-hour days with only one meal break. Usually workers would not work on Sundays, and typically a half day on Saturday, but this all varied based on where they were working. Those were just some common sort of days off, if you will. Sorry, my dog Jack is barking at me like he wants something. It's ridiculous. Okay. So we also have different forms of punishment. So whipping was very, very common, which we've seen depicted in many movies and shows, and depicted in novels. And you guys are reading The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and it's definitely depicted in there, as well as denial of passes, meaning, being able to leave for any amount of time, reduction of food, and definitely selling was a big punishment. Just being sold off to somewhere else entirely, leaving your family and any friends you had behind, and having no say in that, of course. As far as clothing and amenities, most enslaved workers were given, a couple of outfits per year, very poor accommodations, very basic, rudimentary furniture, maybe a couple of pots or dishes. So really, really not given much. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about resistance, and we've talked before about weapons of the weak, but just to refresh your memory, those are ways of resisting that don't involve weapons. One major rebellion that takes place is Nat Turner's Rebellion, which is depicted here in this drawing from a newspaper. Nat Turner was a literate enslaved preacher who was said to have had a kind master in that he allowed him special privileges like reading. And because he was able to read, and he was able to read the Bible, he did become convinced that God had chosen him to punish white people through terror and devastation. So in 1831, he launched his rebellion, where he and 6 other enslaved workers murdered their slaveholder and his family, and then they continued on. They recruited over 70 more enslaved people along the way. They ended up killing 57 white people. This is in Virginia. I don't know if I said that. It does say in the cartoon. So men, women, children. Eventually the revolt was put down about 45 or so hours later, and Nat Turner was executed, and 30 other people were hanged or expelled. So not everyone was caught, clearly, and those that were caught were, not, certainly not, there was no evidence that they had taken part in that, or no concrete evidence. This was one of the more massive revolts, and because it happened a little later on in 1831, it was very fresh in the minds of people during the Civil War. Jack, I wish you'd stop. Okay, slave culture. So family life was difficult to maintain, but they were able to do it, even with the risk of family members being sold and moving to different areas. Adding to that, a lot of children that were being born to enslaved workers were a product of rape. But people still managed to maintain healthy families, even with all these complications. The traditional nuclear family was the ideal, but there were complications, and they managed that. One way for them to express their feelings of, unhappiness or express their hardships was through song, and Frederick Douglass talks about this in his book. He says the songs of the slave represent the sorrows of his heart. He realized that they were a form of rebellion in themselves. But there are also songs to celebrate marriages, Christmas, finishing a harvest, and certainly there were folk tales as, stories of encouragement and a celebration of culture. For religion, slaveholders definitely encouraged Christianity, but they encouraged a carefully controlled Christianity. Preachers often talked of obeying masters, not lying, not stealing, and, this is repulsive to many people who were, forced to sit in on these sermons, basically being told what was right and what was wrong. Many wanted a Christianity, but they wanted one that the masters didn't control. So sometimes they would hold secret meetings at night, especially if there was somebody who could read the Bible, learning that for themselves and occasionally mixing with African traditions. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the Virginia debate of 1832. And so I've mentioned that I did mention Nat Turner's Rebellion, but I also mentioned the publishing of William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. And this was a highly popular abolitionist magazine. So the following year, 1832, is when Western Virginia counties petitioned for gradual emancipation. And so these were just, a few counties in Virginia, and this, they were denied, but the notable part of this is that this is the very last time that Southerners tried to end slavery for themselves. And of course, it's only a handful of counties in Virginia, but nevertheless, this is the very last time. And of course, they never do voluntarily end slavery in the South. Okay, so we're going to pause here. You guys have quite a bit of reading again this week, so I'm trying to make this short and sweet. I will see you next time. Have a great day.